Hello, Internet, and welcome to my run through of the Battle of Blenheim, a battle of the War of Spanish Succession. In fact, the turning point in the War of Spanish Succession, where the war went from basically full advantage of the French and their Bavarian allies into a period where the Grand Alliance actually held great advantage and was able to eventually try an invasion of France itself. It is a very important battle in as much as it was sort of the battle that, after a long time where everything in military history was about sieges, sieges, and more sieges, don't waste your men in open battle. Just take enemy cities and everything will be okay. The Duke of Marlborough basically proved that, yeah, you can also win wars simply by smashing enemy armies until they simply don't have the capacity to fight anymore. This was also the battle that saved the Grand Alliance, which was the anti-French and anti-Philippe d'Anjou forces of the War of Spanish Succession, and it created the reputation of the Duke of Marlborough, who, of course, still today is known as one of the most important British commanders of all time. So let's take a look, shall we? Enjoy. The year is 1704. The War of Spanish Succession is going on its fourth year, and after a couple of quiet years in the beginning where most battles were mostly minor sieges or fighting between the French and the imperial armies in Italy, 1703 had been a very, very good year for the French. Marshal Villars and the Elector of Bavaria had defeated the imperial armies on the Rhine and on the Danube, and had created a direct threat to Vienna, the Habsburg capital. Vienna had, primarily been saved only because the two commanders couldn't really agree on anything and spent most of their time arguing about tactics. But still, in 1704, the threat was still incredibly real, with the French having a massive, massive, massive army on the Rhine and on the Danube, and the empire could really only put maybe 40,000 troops under the so-so military commanders of Prince Louis of Baden and Field Marshal Limburg Sturm in the field in order to oppose them. At the same time, the empire's military response possibilities were further weakened because it had to maintain most of its forces in northern Italy in order to defend the southern approaches from the large French army under Marshal Vendôme, while also deploying forces to observe or, to a certain degree, stop the Ottoman Empire from trying to regain some of the territory it had lost since the siege of Vienna in 1683, and also deploying forces to fight the Hungarian rebel leader Rakoczy in Royal Hungary and just outside Royal Hungary. All in all, it looked like the new French commander Marshal Marsin, along with the reinforcing French commander Marshal Tallard, united with the elected Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, would be able to force their armies into Austria proper, take the imperial capital of Vienna, force the Holy Roman Empire out of the war, and lead to the collapse of the Grand Alliance against France, which would allow the French to consolidate their victory and their hold over the Spanish Empire and join it to the French kingdom, thus creating a hegemony totally unmatched in Europe for 150 years, and which would be impossible to break in any foreseeable future. The emperor did what he could. He called up his best general, Prince Eugene of Savoy, with as many reinforcements as he could from Italy and otherwise, but in the end, the only real hope for the empire and for the alliance was the Duke of Marlborough, the captain general of the Dutch and English combined forces, who was currently stationed around The Hague in order to make a spring offensive into the Spanish Netherlands. Now, the Duke of Marlborough was quite aware of what was going on and was fully prepared to march to the aid of Vienna. However, his Dutch allies would not really allow him to bring their forces so far afield because their primary interest in the war was basically to create a barrier line that would prevent the French from attacking them and conquering more of their territory, as Louis XIV had basically been doing for the last 50 years. Nonetheless, Marlborough, who at this time had full support of the British government under his friend Sidney Godolphin and the Queen Anne, who had taken over from William III when William had died a few years earlier, just before the start of the war, saw further than his Dutch allies and realized that those barrier fortresses would never become a thing insofar as French would win the war, which they most certainly would if they could destroy the Grand Alliance by knocking out the Empire. So he basically decided to, well, deceive his primary allies and march to the salvation of the imperial forces on the Danube. He did this by pretending to move his armies to the Moselle River and attack from there into France, as was the preferred plan of the Dutch republics. However, when he actually got there, he left a small covering force and, under the cover of night and on the far side of the Rhine, marched his forces as quickly as he possibly could towards Bavaria. In fact, he used barges to transport his forces down the Rhine at a rate of almost 80 miles per day, which was, rather surprising that he could move that fast. And after a spectacularly quick march, that for the first time sort of really proved his military genius. In less than a month, he arrived with the primary forces of his armies in order to rendezvous with Prince Louis of Baden, who commanded the lines of Hochstadt, the primary defensive force. The primary defensive lines against French attack, which had sadly, because of the alliance between France and Bavaria, been rather outmaneuvered. The two united their forces and marched further south to intercept the armies of Marsin and the Elector Duke. At this time, the intricacies of the French High Command came to the aid of the Grand Alliance. The French covering forces that were supposed to oppose Marlborough at the Moselle realized that there was absolutely no real English presence there and immediately communicated to Versailles that there is no English around. They have all gone up in Germany. However, because Louis XIV allowed his commanding generals very little, shall we say, operational initiative, Marshal Villeroy, with his primary forces, who realized this, could not move to follow the English and Dutch armies until he got permission from Versailles, which wasn't forthcoming. So that meant that Marshal Marsin, the Elector Duke of Bavaria, and Marshal Tallard with his reinforcements would have to face the combined armies of the Empire and the maritime powers, alone without further support from either Vendôme's army of Italy or Villeroy's army of Strasbourg. Of course, this did not mean that everything was well. The presence of a large French army in Bavaria threatening Vienna was still definitely a thing, and the brilliant logistic march of Marshal Talon in order to bring reinforcements to Marsin and Maximilian's armies cannot be overlooked. It's often forgotten just how brilliantly he did in bringing his reinforcements throughout the Black Forest, because it's overlooked in just how brilliant Marlborough was in bringing his entire goddamn army from the Moselle area to the Danube. But overall, the French still felt like they had a great advantage because they could march towards Vienna, and the Dutch-English army would sort of have to respond to them. For 2 months, the armies were shadowing each other, the French trying to avoid a general engagement and perhaps outmaneuver the opposing forces and resume their march on Vienna. Marlborough and Eugene and Baden desperately trying to either force the French Bavarians to retreat or to force a general engagement that would render Vienna safe. Marlborough eventually resorted to basically having his troops utterly plunder, burn, and pillage the countryside in order to have the elector perhaps being willing to risk a battle in order to defend his fiefdom. And in fact, the elector did, to a certain degree, disperse his armies to try to catch Marlborough's raiders, which created a certain disagreement with his French commanding allies. Eventually, however, in early August, the two armies now faced each other at Hochstadt and Blenheim, villages around the Danube, and it became obvious that one way or the other, things were going to be decided in a great battle. And on the 11th of August, the French made the attack, trying to first destroy Eugene's smaller army before turning on Marlborough's maritime forces. Overall, the armies were fairly evenly matched. The French and Bavarian armies had probably around 60,000 men, with 69 battalions of foot and 128 squadron of cavalry, and around 60 field guns. The Allied Grand Alliance army comprised about 56,000 men is the general occurrence, with 51 battalions of foot and 92 squadrons of horse, of which about 16,000 were British. The rest were Dutch and Imperial troops plus mercenaries from particularly the northern German states and from Denmark. Having their attempts to destroy Eugene's army and then Marlborough's in detail frustrated by the unification of the two armies, the French withdraw to their side of the river and was surprised the next morning when the British and Imperial troops finally made their assault. Marlborough and Eugene had carefully studied the ground and the topography of the area and felt like they had developed a plan that could surprise and overwhelm the French, despite the French being on the defense. When the battle began, Marlborough ordered on his left the General Coots, commanding some British forces, to advance against the village of Blenheim. There, he engaged the French, who were in superior numbers, and was pushed back. Once again, the British went forward without firing a shot in order to close the distance early. However, again, the French repulsed them. Marlborough, realizing that his forces could not take Blenheim, then ordered Coots to simply demonstrate in front of the village to keep the pressure on the French right flank, and this succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, because the local French commander at the scene refused to send troops anywhere else and refused to counterattack and refused to do anything. So a very, very large part of the French armies was simply bottled up in Blenheim, absolutely uselessly watching the British trounce around outside the village with some desultory firing, kept there basically for the rest of the day without doing anything good one way or the other. So by transferring as many forces as he could from Coots back to his right and his center, Marlborough used only about 5,000 of his troops to bottle up the entire French right wing. On the Allied right, near the village of Lutzingen, Prince Eugene then left his camp behind and started the attack with his imperial forces combined with Prussian and Danish mercenaries. These were in desperate assaults in order to keep pressure on the French left flank. They were fighting majorly superior numerical forces under the Elector Duke and Marsin. Several times Eugene threw his forces, particularly his cavalry, across the river, only to see them cut down in murderous crossfire. However, the particular attack did cause the French a good bit of worry, because they felt like this was obviously the main attack, just from the fury that Eugene threw against them. So the French forces themselves became disorganized and focused totally on Eugene's flank attack. When the flanks were thus engaged, Marlborough then launched his primary attack up the center, crossing the Naple on a reconstructed stone bridge that his engineers had repaired, as well as several pontoon bridges. He deployed his infantry formations in front, with almost 72 cavalry squadrons behind, ready to exploit any kind of breakthrough. As the British attacked, Tallard, who commanded the center, released his most primary forces, namely the gendarmes, which was the elite royal cavalry of the French army, to attack Marlborough's horsemen and, if possibly, sever the link between Marlborough's center and Coote's forces on the Allied left. However, the gendarmes were faced with withering and very steady volley fire and had to retreat in some confusion. Some actually say they were deliberately fleeing. This, of course, discomforted the rest of the French forces heavily, as this was the elite forces of the French army that, could not be beat, had to win at all times, because they were literally the hand of Louis XIV itself. It is said, in fact, that the elector duke, when he realized this, just exclaimed, "What? The gentlemen of France are fleeing? This cannot be!" However, the British attempt to follow up this success was repulsed by, in some confusion, by other French cavalry and by musketry fire, which came also from the edges of Blenheim, where, at least after all, quite a few troops were bottled up. La at this point then attempted a counterattack against Marlborough, and did manage to push back the Allied forces to a certain degree, but because the French right wing was bottled up in Blenheim, and because Marsing and the Elector on the other side of the field were so convinced that Eugene's attack was the primary Allied advance, he could not receive the needed reinforcements to fully break the Allied center, and for a while the battle sort of stopped, with all three areas being fought to a standstill on both sides. Marlborough, however, realizing at this point that the French high command was divided, then transferred even more troops from Coote, allowing him to again bottle up the entire French right wing with only a very small skeleton force, then reordered himself and Eugene to continue the attack. Reinforced by these extra troops, Marlborough's army again went forward. For a while, it seemed like the French would be able to stem the tide, but the French cavalry, who did most of the work, were tired. The Allies were reinforced, the Allies had morale, and eventually Marlborough's fierce attack broke the French center. The French cavalry desperately tried to escape, and while some reached Hochstadt, many more, perhaps up to 3,000, were drowned in the Naple. The French infantry of the center attempted to stand by forming square to protect themselves from Marlborough's now rampaging cavalry, but Marlborough brought up his own infantry and artillery for close-range platoon fire, and with basically his artillery acting as gigantic shotguns and his own infantry able to outflank and surround the French, annihilated the final 9 French battalions, where they stood almost to the last man. Tallard himself, trying to stem the defeat and rally his fleeing troops, was surrounded by some Hessian horsemen, captured and brought to Marlborough as a prisoner of war. At this point, the French had been split in two, with the center utterly destroyed. On the Allied right, Eugene had also re-established his attack against the Bavarian stronghold at the village of Lützingen. However, as his attack again stalled, he became exasperated with his imperial troops and declared in disgust that he wished to fight amongst brave men and not amongst cowards. He instead went personally into the attack with his Prussian and Danish mercenary infantry and made one last-ditch attack on the French and Bavarians. This, of course, was more than his imperial troops' pride could stomach, so they re-rallied and attacked again with fierce fury. This time, however, the Prussians and the Danes managed to storm the great Bavarian artillery battery that had defended the town and overwhelmed the gun's crew. The Danes then turned around and defeated the French infantry in a desperate hand-to-hand bayonet struggle. At this point, being pressed so fiercely, the French under Marseng and the Elector realized that Talar's center had been broken, and desperately fearing to be cut off, they ordered their men to retreat, harried all the way by the remaining horsemen that Eugene had to in his command. All that now remained was the French wing bottled up in Blenheim. Its commander, Clérambault, who had made the terrible mistake of keeping his forces within the village where they could do no good one way or the other, now realized that the battle was lost and abandoned his troops to try to escape. However, he is never seen again, and the rumored is that he drowned in the river trying to swim it. However, the French, of course, had such numbers in the village that they were able to resist the initial Allied storming attempts. However, as the day progressed, they became ever more surrounded, and realizing that the rest of their forces had been driven into wild panic and defeat, eventually, in the evening, the secondary commander of Blenheim surrendered his entire wing, which meant that more than 10,000 of France's best infantry basically laid down their arms to become prisoners of war without truly firing a shot. At this time, the battle won, Marlborough attempted to conduct a pursuit of the broken enemy and did in fact manage to eventually push them all the way out of Bavaria. It was at this moment that he scribbled on the back of an old tavern bill he had a note to his wife Sarah, which has become famous, and which read, "I have no time to say more to you now, but beg to you that you will give my duty to the Queen and let her know that her army has had a glorious victory." And it had. The French had been utterly broken, and the Allied armies had gained a most glorious victory. The effect and meaning of the Battle of Blenheim is hard to overstate. In one afternoon, the Grand Alliance was saved. The myth that has arisen over the last 15 years of French military invincibility was utterly shattered. It created the almost invincible military team of Prince Eugene and the Duke of Marlborough. It gave the initiative to the maritime powers and its imperial allies that would last for basically the next 5 to 6 years of the war, and in fact only some diplomatic difficulties between the maritime powers and the empire probably prevented a total French defeat in the War of Spanish Succession. It proved that under a good general, a field battle was just as important as various sieges, and it knocked Bavaria totally out of the war, depriving France of its most powerful ally and allowing the imperial forces to retake the offensive in Italy and the maritime powers to finally begin the invasion of France after French had been basically in command of the war for the first 4 years. Overall, the battle is one of the most important ever fought in Europe, as it established the beginning of a British military preeminence that would last for 200 years, and in fact needed the full alliance of the Kingdom of France and the United States of America to even temporarily break. It is very interesting. I feel everyone should read up on it just for military tactics and to see how deception and diplomacy and military genius can work hand in hand. I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of the Battle of Blenheim. It, of course, wasn't a comprehensive thing. I think you should definitely read up on it. There's a wonderful website just called the BritishBattles.com, which basically has a run through of a lot, if not all, battles fought in modern times by British armies, which has a very, very good and very, very close run-through of the Battle of Blenheim. I also apologize for doing yet another battle run-through, but I have only just, as you perhaps know, recently returned from the United States of America, and I didn't really have the time to do full research into some other videos I might want to do. Next week, we are probably going to see another travel diary, so look forward to that. And after that, I think it might actually be time to possibly turn our sights on America with a general history video regarding something I haven't actually decided yet. But until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.